On October 17, 1884, in the prosperous mill town of Ashwick, Massachusetts, construction workers excavating for a new textile warehouse made a discovery that would shatter the community's genteel facade forever. Beneath the recently demolished Holloway estate at 47 Millbridge Road, they uncovered not one, but 7 male corpses in various states of preservation, each wrapped meticulously in oilcloth and arranged in what the foreman would later describe as a grotesque parody of a family portrait. The bodies, aged between 28 and 45 years at time of death, had been accumulating in that cellar for nearly 2 decades. The widow Sarah Holloway, who had buried 4 husbands in proper cemetery plots between 1867 and 1883, had apparently kept 3 additional ones, and 4 other men besides, in her personal collection beneath the floorboards. Records of this investigation were sealed by order of Judge Cornelius Blackwood for 97 years, ostensibly to protect the reputations of prominent families whose sons had vanished without explanation during Mrs. Holloway's reign as Ashwick's most eligible widow. What the construction crew couldn't have known that autumn morning, as they stumbled backward from the neat row of preserved corpses, was that they had uncovered merely the centerpiece of a methodical operation that had functioned in plain sight for 17 years. Sarah Holloway had not simply murdered these men. According to the medical examiner's suppressed report, she had maintained them, some for months after death, in a state that suggested purposes far more disturbing than simple disposal. The most unsettling detail, noted in Detective Inspector Thomas Ashford's personal journal, was the discovery of place settings in the cellar. 7 chairs arranged around a makeshift table, 7 sets of fine china, and evidence of regular dinner parties that Mrs. Holloway had conducted with her silent guests. But perhaps the question that haunted investigators most was not how she had killed them, or even why she had kept them. It was how a woman of barely 5 feet in height and 110 pounds had managed to transport 7 grown men into her cellar without anyone in gossipy, watchful Ashwick noticing a thing. Before we continue with Sarah Holloway's methodical descent into calculated madness, if this story intrigues you, make sure you've hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because what you're about to discover isn't just another true crime tale. It's a systematically buried piece of American history that someone, somewhere, decided you shouldn't know about. I want to build a community of the truly brave here, those who aren't afraid to stare into the darker corners of our past. So tell us in the comments below, what state or city are you from? I'm particularly curious if anyone's from Massachusetts, especially the Merrimack Valley area. You might have heard whispers of this story through your own family histories, though likely sanitized versions that omit what really happened in that cellar. Only the bravest listeners, the true mystery seekers among you, will make it through what's coming next. Because understanding Sarah Holloway means understanding how an entire community can become complicit in horror through their willful blindness. And that's a mirror that many find too uncomfortable to look into. Ashwick, Massachusetts, in the 1860s through 1880s, was the very picture of New England prosperity. Situated along the Merrimack River, 37 miles north of Boston, the town had transformed from a modest farming community into a thriving industrial center. The Ashwick cotton mills employed nearly 3,000 workers, drawing Irish and French-Canadian immigrants to work alongside the established Yankee families who owned the grand houses on Federal Street and Millbridge Road. The 1880 census recorded 8432 souls in Ashwick proper, making it large enough for anonymity, yet small enough that everyone believed they knew their neighbor's business. The social structure was rigidly defined. At the apex sat the mill owners and investors, the Blackwoods, Cabots, and Worthingtons, who attended the Congregational Church on Sundays and whose wives organized charitable societies for the moral improvement of the working classes. Below them, a growing middle class of merchants, doctors, and skilled tradesmen occupied the neat Greek Revival homes along elm-lined streets. The mill workers crowded into boarding houses and tenements near the river, their lives regulated by the factory bells that rang 6 days a week. It was into this carefully ordered world that Sarah Holloway had arrived in 1866, a young widow of 24, dressed in expensive but tasteful mourning attire. Her late husband, she explained to anyone who inquired, had been a Philadelphia shipping merchant named Charles Pemberton who had succumbed to consumption. She carried letters of introduction from respectable Philadelphia families, later discovered to be forgeries of exceptional quality, and possessed enough capital to purchase the handsome Federal-style home at 47 Millbridge Road, just 2 blocks from the town common. Mrs. Holloway, as she preferred to be called, quickly established herself as a model of propriety. She attended services at the Congregational Church without fail, contributed generously to the Ladies' Benevolent Society, and hosted weekly tea gatherings that became coveted invitations among Ashwick's middle-class matrons. Her mourning period for the fictional Mr. Pemberton was observed with precisely the correct duration and depth of grief, not so brief as to seem callous, not so extended as to seem morbid. The town's eligible bachelors soon took notice. Sarah Holloway possessed a delicate beauty that seemed enhanced by her widow's weeds, pale skin that suggested refinement rather than illness, dark hair always perfectly arranged beneath her bonnets, and large brown eyes that could convey depths of sympathy and understanding. More importantly, she had property and evident means. In an era when women could rarely own businesses or manage their own finances without male oversight, a wealthy widow represented one of the few forms of female independence that society could tolerate. Her first Ashwick husband, Mr. Jonathan Hartwell, was a 38-year-old widower who owned a successful dry goods store on Main Street. Their courtship in 1867 was conducted with absolute propriety, chaperoned walks after church, carefully supervised parlor visits, and the exchange of entirely appropriate gifts. The wedding in September 1867 was modest but elegant, attended by most of Ashwick's merchant class. If anyone found it odd that Mrs. Holloway had no family present, they attributed it to the sad isolation that often befell young widows. Mr. Hartwell's death 14 months later from what Dr. Elias Morton diagnosed as acute gastric distress surprised no one. Several men in the community had suffered similar ailments that year, attributed to contaminated water from the river. Sarah Holloway's grief appeared genuine and profound. She nursed her husband devotedly through his final weeks, refusing to leave his bedside, administering his medicines with her own hands. The funeral was respectable, the monument she erected was tasteful, and her return to mourning attire was accompanied by such evident sorrow that the town's matrons rallied around her. What made Sarah Holloway's activities possible for so long was not merely her careful performance of respectability, but the very structure of Ashwick society itself. The town's prosperity depended upon maintaining its reputation as a model industrial community. Scandal was bad for business. The mill owners who controlled the local newspaper, the police force, and even the churches had a vested interest in preserving the fiction that Ashwick was a beacon of American progress and moral rectitude. Moreover, the constant influx of new workers meant that disappearances were often attributed to the transient nature of mill town life. Men left for better opportunities, returned to their home countries, or simply vanished into the growing cities. The very prosperity that made Ashwick proud also made it easy for people to go missing without much question. The town's 4 policemen were far more concerned with preventing union organization at the mills than investigating the romantic misfortunes of middle-aged men. It was this combination of rigid respectability, willful blindness, and structural indifference that allowed Sarah Holloway to operate for 17 years. Ashwick needed to believe in its own virtue more than it needed to ask uncomfortable questions about a charming widow's remarkable string of marital tragedies. Sarah Holloway had perfected the art of being precisely what people expected to see. To the ladies of the benevolent society, she was a model of Christian fortitude, bearing her repeated losses with a grace that inspired admiration rather than suspicion. To the town's eligible men, she represented a rare combination of beauty, wealth, and vulnerability that awakened both desire and protective instincts. To the servants and tradespeople, she was unfailingly polite, prompt with payment, and generous with small kindnesses that ensured loyalty and discretion. Her public persona was a masterwork of calculated details. She maintained correspondence with fictional relatives in Philadelphia, occasionally sharing carefully edited portions of these letters during her tea gatherings. "My dear cousin Elizabeth writes that the grief never truly fades," she would sigh, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, "but that we must trust in Providence's plan." These non-existent relatives provided convenient excuses for occasional absences and explanations for her continued wealth: inheritance from an uncle here, a settlement from a distant estate there. The widow cultivated specific relationships with key figures in Ashwick society. Dr. Elias Morton, the town's most respected physician, became her unofficial medical advisor and unknowingly her most valuable enabler. She suffered from nervous exhaustion and feminine complaints that required regular house calls and prescribed medications: laudanum, mercury compounds, and arsenical tonics that were common treatments for wealthy women's ailments. Dr. Morton, a 60-year-old bachelor with a weakness for tragic beauties, never questioned why Mrs. Holloway required such quantities of these substances. Sheriff Benjamin Cross, a bluff, straightforward man who prided himself on maintaining order, saw in Mrs. Holloway a respectable widow who deserved protection from unwanted suitors and traveling salesmen. She would occasionally request his assistance with disturbances: a suspicious character loitering near her property, strange noises in the night that frightened her. These requests, always accompanied by grateful tears and modest gifts to the policeman's benevolent fund, ensured that law enforcement saw her as a victim requiring protection rather than a predator requiring investigation. Perhaps her most useful unwitting accomplice was Mr. Aldrich Crane, who operated Ashwick's largest funeral establishment. Mrs. Holloway had become, through her multiple bereavements, one of his most reliable customers. She insisted on handling many of the preparations herself, out of devotion, she explained, and always requested closed casket services due to the devastating effects of her husband's final illnesses. Mr. Crane, who appreciated both her business and her stoic dignity in the face of repeated loss, never questioned her specific requests or the generous gratuities that accompanied them. The warning signs were there for those who might have looked. Her second Ashwick husband, Mr. Robert Donnelly, a 40-year-old owner of a small brass foundry, had mentioned to his foreman a week before his death that his wife's evening teas tasted peculiar. Metallic, he said, with an odd sweetness. But Donnelly was known to complain about everything from his workers to the weather, so his grumbling about his wife's tea was dismissed as typical grousing. Mrs. Margaret Fielding, who lived across Millbridge Road, once mentioned at a church social that she often saw lamplight in the Holloway cellar at unusual hours, 2, 3 in the morning. "That poor dear," the other ladies clucked, "probably can't sleep for grief." Mrs. Fielding also noted that delivery boys from the ice house seemed to call at the Holloway residence with unusual frequency, even in cool weather, but ice delivery schedules were hardly the stuff of scandal. There was the curious case of Mr. James Whitfield, a traveling insurance agent who had courted Mrs. Holloway in 1873. He had abruptly left town, according to Sarah, after she had gently refused his proposal. His samples case was found abandoned at the train station, but everyone assumed he had been too embarrassed to retrieve it. The fact that he had been seen entering the Holloway residence the evening before his disappearance, but never seen leaving, was attributed to the failing eyesight of old Mr. Josiah Pratt, who spent his days watching the street from his front window. Sarah Holloway's greatest deception, however, was not in what she concealed, but in what she displayed. Her grief was always public, perfect, and performed. She commissioned beautiful mourning jewelry, brooches containing locks of hair, rings with hidden compartments for miniature photographs. She tended her husband's graves with devotion, bringing fresh flowers weekly. She even established a small charitable fund in memory of her deceased spouses, providing winter coats for impoverished children. This performance of perpetual mourning served multiple purposes. It explained her wealth, insurance policies, and inheritances, justified her reclusiveness, overwhelming grief, and most importantly, it made her sympathetic rather than suspicious. In a society that romanticized female suffering and prized women who devoted themselves to their husbands' memories, Sarah Holloway had found the perfect disguise. The town's merchants noted that she purchased unusual quantities of lamp oil, quicklime, and other household substances, but a wealthy widow maintaining a large home required many supplies. The chemistry professor at nearby Ashwick College, whom she occasionally consulted about removing stains from precious fabrics, found her interest in chemical processes unusual, but attributed it to the natural curiosity of an intelligent woman with too much time on her hands. Each small oddity, taken alone, meant nothing. Together, they painted a picture that no one in Ashwick wanted to see. The unraveling of Sarah Holloway's 17-year masquerade began not with the Cellar's discovery, but 6 months earlier, in April 1884, with what seemed like a minor domestic incident. Thomas Brennan, a 17-year-old delivery boy from Morrison's grocery, arrived at the Holloway residence with the weekly order. Finding the kitchen door ajar and receiving no response to his calls, he entered. A liberty he would never have taken had Mrs. Holloway not always been so kind to him, often offering him fresh-baked cookies and cold lemonade. The house was silent except for a rhythmic creaking from below. Thinking Mrs. Holloway might have fallen in the cellar, young Brennan descended the stairs. What he saw in the lamplight sent him stumbling backward. Mrs. Holloway, still in her church dress, seated at a table with 7 well-dressed men. She was serving tea, speaking animatedly to her guests about the sermon that morning. The only problem was that none of the men moved. Not one of them breathed. Their skin had a waxy, grayish pallor that even in the dim light was unmistakably wrong. Brennan fled. He would later tell his employer, Mr. Morrison, that Mrs. Holloway had been entertaining corpses like they were living folk. Morrison, a practical man who valued the widow's substantial weekly orders, dismissed the boy's tale as the product of an overactive imagination. Perhaps young Brennan had seen Mrs. Holloway with her mourning dolls. Many widows kept such mementos. The boy's insistence led only to his dismissal. He left Ashwick within the week, but not before sharing his story with several other young men, planting seeds of unease that would soon germinate. The second incident occurred in late May. Dr. Elias Morton received an urgent summons to the Holloway residence. Mrs. Holloway's latest husband, Mr. Frederick Bellows, a 50-year-old banker who had married her just 8 months prior, was gravely ill. Dr. Morton found Bellows barely conscious, his symptoms alarmingly familiar. Violent stomach cramping, excessive salivation, dilated pupils, and a peculiar blue-green tinge to his vomit that the doctor had seen before. The same symptoms, Dr. Morton would later write in his private journal, as Hartwell, Donnelly, and Westbrook, 4 men, 4 marriages, 4 identical illnesses. For the first time, the pattern was too clear to ignore. But what troubled Morton most was Mrs. Holloway's demeanor. She was performing grief. He could see it now, like watching an actress who had played the same role too many times. Her tears came precisely when expected, her hands trembled on cue, but her eyes remained cold, observant, watching him as much as he was watching her. Morton attempted to move Bellows to the hospital, but Sarah insisted on caring for him at home. "It's what a devoted wife does," she said, and in front of the neighbors who had gathered, Morton could hardly argue. He left medicines with strict instructions and promised to return in the morning. Frederick Bellows died at 3:47 a.m. Sarah Holloway was the only witness. The third escalation came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Catherine Walsh, the Holloway's Irish housemaid who came twice weekly, approached Father Patrick O'Brien at St. Joseph's Catholic Church in early July. She was seeking confession but also guidance. In the 2 years she had worked for Mrs. Holloway, she had noticed things. The basement door was always locked, and Mrs. Holloway kept the only key. Strange smells emanated from below, sometimes chemical, like the photography studio on Main Street, sometimes sweet and cloying, sometimes like spoiled meat. More disturbing were the sounds, furniture being moved in the dead of night. Mrs. Holloway's voice, conversational and cheerful, followed by long silences where responses should have been. Once, Catherine had found a man's gold pocket watch in the kitchen, not Mr. Bellows, who was still alive then. When she'd brought it to Mrs. Holloway, the widow had gone very still, then smiled and said it must belong to a tradesman. But Catherine had recognized it. She'd seen it before on Mr. James Whitfield, the insurance agent who had supposedly left town years ago. Father O'Brien faced a terrible dilemma. The sanctity of confession bound him, but Mrs. Walsh hadn't confessed to a sin. She had reported suspected crimes. He chose a middle path, suggesting to Sheriff Cross that he might want to look into the welfare of Mrs. Holloway, a poor widow who might be suffering from nervous exhaustion and delusions brought on by repeated grief. Sheriff Cross, accompanied by Dr. Morton, paid a courtesy call on July 18th. They found Mrs. Holloway in perfect health and spirits, graciously serving tea in her parlor. She expressed gratitude for their concern, allowed them to tour the main floors of her home, and even showed them her collection of mourning memorabilia, photographs, locks of hair, personal effects of her deceased husbands. Everything seemed in order. The cellar door, she explained, remained locked because she stored valuable preserves there, and the dampness wasn't good for her rheumatism. It might have ended there, another close call in Sarah Holloway's long deception, except for what happened on October 16, 1884. A violent thunderstorm struck Ashwick, and lightning hit the old elm tree beside the Holloway house. The tree fell, its massive root system tearing up a section of the garden and cracking the foundation of the house. Water began flooding into the cellar. Mrs. Holloway appeared at Sheriff Cross's office at dawn, more agitated than anyone had ever seen her. She needed immediate assistance, she said. The flooding was destroying precious family heirlooms stored in the cellar. Could he send men to help her move things immediately? Her urgency was so unlike her usual composure that Cross became suspicious. He agreed to help but insisted on accompanying the work crew himself. When they arrived at the Holloway residence, Sarah tried to direct them only to certain areas of the cellar. but the damage was extensive and water was rising quickly. The workers spread out, moving through the gloom with their lanterns. It was Michael O'Sullivan, a burly Irishman who'd worked in the mills for 20 years, who made the discovery. His shout brought everyone running. In an alcove behind a false wall that had been damaged by the tree roots, they found them. 3 bodies in various states of preservation, wrapped in oilcloth and arranged on makeshift shelving like inventory in a storehouse. The smell released by the breach in the wall was indescribable. Formaldehyde, decay, and something else, something sweet and chemical that burned the nostrils. But it was the second discovery that truly revealed the horror. Beyond the storage area was a finished room, set up like a dining parlor. A table with 7 place settings. 7 chairs, 4 occupied by bodies dressed in their finest clothes, positioned as if in conversation. On the walls, photographs, dozens of them, of Sarah Holloway with various men, all taken after their deaths, posed in grotesque parodies of domestic life. Sheriff Cross found Sarah Holloway in her bedroom, calmly packing a valise. "I suppose," she said without looking up, "you'll want to see the others now." She reached into her bodice and withdrew a key. "They're in the old root cellar behind the main basement, my special ones. The ones who understood." Dr. Morton, arriving at the scene, would later describe what they found in that secondary cellar as a violation of both medical science and human decency. 4 more bodies, including James Whitfield, the insurance agent. But these weren't simply stored. They showed evidence of prolonged post-mortem manipulation. Injection sites suggested experimentation with various preservatives. 1 corpse had been partially dissected and reassembled. Notes in Sarah's precise handwriting, found in a nearby desk, detailed her attempts to permanently preserve tissue, to maintain flexibility in the joints, to create what she called eternal companions. The most disturbing discovery was the final entry in her journal, dated October 15th, the night before the storm. "Frederick's color is finally stabilizing. The new formula works much better. Soon he'll be ready to join the others for our anniversary dinner. How pleased Charles would be to see how our family has grown." Charles Pemberton, her first husband, the Philadelphia merchant who had died of consumption, the one she'd been mourning when she arrived in Ashwick. Investigators would later discover that no such person had ever existed in Philadelphia's records. The question that would haunt them: if her first husband was a fiction, who was the Charles she wrote about with such twisted affection? If this is giving you chills, you're not alone. When I first discovered these sealed records in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives, I had to stop reading several times. What Sarah Holloway did goes beyond simple murder. It enters a realm of systematic horror that challenges our understanding of what humans are capable of. But here's what's truly disturbing. We haven't even gotten to the worst part yet. What the investigators found in her private correspondence, the depth of her network, and the true identity of Charles. It all points to something far more organized than one widow's madness. Make sure you've hit that like button if you want to see more deep dives into America's buried history. And share this with someone you think is brave enough to handle the truth. Because what I'm about to reveal next explains not just what Sarah Holloway did, but why an entire town's power structure worked to bury this story for almost a century. Let's discover together what happens when we pull back the veil on Ashwick's darkest secret. Because Sarah Holloway, she wasn't working alone. The investigation that followed the October 17th discovery would consume the Massachusetts State Police, hastily summoned from Boston when it became clear that Ashwick's small force was overwhelmed for the next 3 months. What they uncovered was not the work of a deranged widow, but a methodical operation that had refined its techniques over nearly 2 decades. The physical evidence was cataloged with scientific precision by Dr. Harrison Blackstone, the state's leading forensic examiner, brought in specifically for this case. His report, running to 347 pages, would remain sealed until 1981. In the primary cellar, investigators found 11 bodies in total, the 7 initially discovered, plus 4 more concealed behind false walls. Each corpse had been treated with different preservation methods, suggesting a process of experimentation and refinement. The earliest victims showed crude attempts at preservation using arsenic and mercury compounds. The later ones demonstrated an evolving sophistication. Mr. Frederick Bellows, her most recent victim, had been injected with a solution that Dr. Blackstone identified as containing formaldehyde, methanol, and what appeared to be an early form of arterial embalming fluid that wouldn't become standard mortuary practice for another decade. His body showed evidence of systematic blood drainage and replacement, performed while he was still alive but paralyzed. Needle marks on his neck indicated repeated doses of curare, a paralytic agent Sarah had somehow obtained from South America. But it was Sarah's personal laboratory, hidden behind the root cellar, that revealed the true scope of her activities. Glass jars lined the shelves, containing organs preserved in various chemical solutions. Each was labeled with a date, a name, and notes on the preservation method used. Hearts primarily. The seat of affection, she had written on one label, must be perfectly maintained. Her journal, recovered from a hidden compartment in her bedroom, spanned 18 years and contained over 1,200 pages of meticulous notes. The entries began innocuously enough: recipes, household accounts, observations on her neighbors. But by 1867, the tone had changed dramatically. She wrote of her great work, her eternal family, and most disturbingly, her correspondence with Charles. Charles, investigators discovered, was Charles Baudelaire, the French poet who had died in 1867, the same year Sarah began her killing spree. She had somehow obtained a copy of Les Fleurs du Mal and had become obsessed with his poems about death, decay, and preservation. She believed he was communicating with her through his poetry, guiding her in creating what she called a garden of eternal companions where death becomes merely another form of life. The victim testimonies came not from survivors, there were none, but from the detailed records Sarah kept of each man's final days. She had documented their symptoms as she slowly poisoned them, noting with clinical detachment their hallucinations, their pleas, their gradual descent into paralysis. Mr. Robert Donnelly, her second Ashwick husband, had apparently remained conscious but unable to move for 3 days before death. She had spent those days explaining to him how he would be improved after death, how she would perfect him. Her selection process was methodical. Each victim was chosen for specific qualities: physical appearance, social standing, and most importantly, their isolation. She targeted men with few family connections, whose disappearances wouldn't prompt extensive searches. The 4 non-husbands found in her cellar were all traveling merchants or seasonal workers, men whose absence would be noted but not investigated. The systematic approach extended to every aspect of her operation. She had cultivated relationships with suppliers across New England, never ordering enough from any single source to raise suspicion. Arsenic from a pharmacy in Boston for rat problems. Formaldehyde from a medical supply company in Providence for preserving botanical specimens. Quicklime from a construction supplier in Worcester for gardening purposes. Financial records revealed that she had been funding her activities through a combination of insurance policies, forged wills, and theft from her victims' accounts. She had become an expert at forgery, creating documents that passed even bank scrutiny. Mr. James Whitfield's insurance company had been paying out policies to her for 5 years after his death, believing him to have relocated to California and named her as beneficiary. But the most disturbing discoveries came from what investigators termed the performance rooms. Beyond the dining setup, they found a parlor where bodies were arranged in reading positions, books open in their laps. A music room where one corpse was positioned at a piano, fingers placed on the keys. Sarah's journal revealed that she would spend hours in these rooms, carrying on elaborate one-sided conversations, even hosting tea parties for other unwitting guests while her preserved victims sat in adjacent rooms. Dr. Morton, when questioned under oath, broke down completely. He admitted, begun to suspect something was wrong after Frederick Bellow's death. The symptoms were too consistent, the pattern too clear. But he had been receiving monthly payments from Sarah Holloway, not bribes exactly, but consultation fees and donations to his planned hospital. He had convinced himself that his suspicions were unfounded, that Sarah was simply an unfortunate woman cursed with tragic luck. The investigation revealed that Sarah had maintained detailed records of her poisoning regimens. She had discovered that small doses of arsenic, administered over time, created symptoms that mimicked common diseases of the era: gastric fever, consumption, heart disease. She had learned to adjust doses based on body weight and constitution. She had even developed a schedule that allowed her to predict almost to the hour when her victims would succumb. More horrifying still were her experiments in what she called living preservation. Several victims showed evidence of being injected with preservative compounds while still alive, creating a state where they remained conscious but increasingly paralyzed as their blood was slowly replaced with embalming fluid. Her notes suggested she believed this process would somehow transfer their life essence into a permanent state, creating companions who existed between life and death. The discovery of her correspondence files revealed a network that extended beyond Ashwick. She had been in communication with someone in Boston, signing themselves only as MF, who had been supplying her with exotic chemicals and pharmaceutical compounds not readily available through normal channels. Letters suggested this person was aware of her activities and possibly engaged in similar pursuits. The police would never identify MF, despite extensive investigation. A hidden room adjacent to the laboratory contained what Sarah called her gallery, daguerreotypes and early photographs she had taken of her victims at various stages. Some showed the men alive, unaware they were being photographed through hidden cameras she had installed in her home. Others documented the poisoning process, their gradual deterioration captured in haunting detail. The final photographs showed them after death, posed in lifelike positions, Sarah often seated beside them as if they were any ordinary couple. The state chemist, Dr. William Forbes, identified at least 15 different toxic compounds in Sarah's laboratory, including several that were unknown to American medicine at the time. She had somehow obtained samples of tropical poisons, including curare and compounds derived from plants that grew only in remote regions of South America and Africa. Her knowledge of chemistry rivaled that of trained pharmacists. Entirely self-taught through correspondence courses she had taken under false names and books ordered from medical colleges. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of her future plans journal. Sarah had been preparing to expand her operations. She had been corresponding with widows in other cities, sharing recipes for medicinal teas and nerve tonics. She had been planning to travel, to spread her methods to what she called sister gardeners who would tend their own eternal gardens. Among her papers, investigators found a manifesto of sorts, written in French and English, where she outlined her philosophy. Death, she argued, was merely a transition state that could be controlled and perfected. The dead, properly preserved and maintained, were superior to the living, They couldn't betray, couldn't leave, couldn't disappoint. They were, in her words, perfected in their stillness, eternal in their silence, and faithful in their permanence. The final count of victims would never be definitively established. Sarah Holloway admitted to the 11 found in her cellar, but hinted at others during her interrogation. Some gardens, she said cryptically, must be planted elsewhere to truly flourish. Investigators suspected she had disposed of earlier failed experiments in the Merrimack River or in the forests surrounding Ashwick, but no additional bodies were recovered despite extensive searching. When Sheriff Cross asked her directly how many men she had killed, Sarah Holloway smiled and replied, "I never killed anyone, Sheriff. I transformed them. I gave them permanence in an impermanent world. They live still in their way. Can you say the same about your own loved ones who lie rotting in the ground?" The evidence revealed one final, chilling detail. In her bedroom, investigators found plans for her own preservation. She had been preparing a special solution, what she called her final transformation. She intended, when her time came, to have herself preserved using her perfected methods and placed at the head of the table in her cellar dining room, presiding over her eternal family, forever. A letter found in her desk, addressed to MF in Boston, contained detailed instructions for this procedure and a substantial payment to ensure its completion. The investigation into Sarah Holloway's activities took a darker turn when Detective Inspector Thomas Ashford of the Boston Police Department arrived in Ashwick on October 20th, 1884. Ashford had been specifically requested not for his investigative skills, though they were considerable, but because he had been tracking a series of similar cases across New England for the past 3 years. Cases that had been quietly dismissed or buried by local authorities. Within hours of reviewing Sarah's correspondence, Ashford recognized patterns he'd seen before. The mysterious MF in Boston matched the handwriting of letters found at 2 other scenes. The 1881 disappearance of 3 men from a boarding house in Providence run by a widow named Mrs. Constance Blackwood, and the 1882 discovery of preserved human remains in the basement of a Manchester, New Hampshire mansion owned by the recently deceased Mrs. Victoria Ashworth. Both cases had been swiftly closed, the evidence sealed, and the investigating officers transferred or retired. Ashford's pursuit of these connections immediately met resistance. Judge Cornelius Blackwood, notably sharing a surname with the Providence widow, issued an injunction limiting the investigation's scope to the specific crimes of Mrs. Sarah Holloway within Ashwick proper. When Ashford protested, he received a midnight visit at his hotel from 2 men who identified themselves only as concerned citizens. They suggested, while examining their pistols, that Boston had enough crime to occupy him without stirring up trouble for respectable families. Undeterred, Ashford began working with Father O'Brien, who had become haunted by his failure to act on Catherine Walsh's warnings. Together, they uncovered a disturbing pattern. The Catholic Church's records, more detailed than their Protestant counterparts, showed that 23 women matching Sarah Holloway's general description had arrived in various New England towns between 1865 and 1884. All were widows, all possessed letters of introduction from prominent families, all purchased large homes suitable for entertaining, and all eventually buried at least one husband before disappearing. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mr. Aldrich Crane, the funeral director, approached Ashford in secret. He had been reviewing his records and discovered something troubling. Over the past 15 years, he had received orders for specialized embalming equipment and chemicals from funeral homes across New England, all from establishments that served towns where wealthy widows had suffered tragic losses. The orders were always paid in advance, in cash, and signed with different names but identical handwriting. More disturbing still, Crane revealed that in 1879 he had attended a funeral directors' convention in Hartford, Connecticut. There, he had met a woman calling herself Mrs. Margaret Fletcher, who claimed to be researching advanced preservation techniques for a medical college thesis. She had asked detailed questions about arterial embalming, organ preservation, and chemical compounds that could maintain tissue flexibility. Crane had been flattered by her interest and had spent hours explaining trade secrets. The woman's description matched Sarah Holloway exactly. Ashford's investigation led him to Dr. Matthias Frankel, a German immigrant who operated a chemical supply company in Boston's West End. Initially reluctant to speak, Frankel eventually admitted under pressure that he had been supplying exotic compounds to several women over the past decade. They all claimed to be conducting scientific research, and they paid triple his normal rates for discretion. He had suspected something was amiss, but, as he put it, "In America, I mind my own business and count my profits." The records Frankel provided were damning. Orders for curare, exotic plant alkaloids, and experimental preservation compounds had been shipped to addresses in 12 different cities. Cross-referencing these locations with mysterious deaths and disappearances revealed a horrifying correlation. In each city, within 6 months of a delivery, at least one prominent man had died of gastric distress or heart failure, and in 7 cases, men had simply vanished. Sheriff Cross, initially skeptical of a larger conspiracy, became convinced when he discovered that his own predecessor, Sheriff William Hartley, had begun a similar investigation in 1878. Hartley's private papers, found in his widow's attic, revealed that he had been tracking Sarah Holloway's activities and had connected her to a woman in Boston known as the Widow Fleming. Before he could act, Hartley had died suddenly of what was recorded as apoplexy. His widow mentioned that Sarah Holloway had kindly brought them a therapeutic tea during his final illness. The investigation took its darkest turn when Ashford tracked down Thomas Brennan, the delivery boy who had first witnessed Sarah's cellar tableau. Now hiding in Worcester, Brennan revealed that he had seen more than he initially reported. On the cellar table had been letters, correspondence between Sarah and other women discussing their collections and sharing recipes. One letter had been signed, "Your sister in the great work, M.F., with a Boston address. Brennan had memorized it before fleeing. The address led to a brownstone in Beacon Hill owned by Mrs. Millicent Fairweather, a wealthy widow who had buried 3 husbands and was currently engaged to a 4th. When police arrived with a warrant on November 3rd, they found she had fled, leaving behind a house that appeared normal until they discovered the locked 3rd floor. There, in rooms that mirrored Sarah Holloway's cellar, they found 4 preserved bodies and evidence of ongoing experiments. But Mrs. Fairweather had been more careful than Sarah. She had left no journals, no detailed records, only a single letter apparently deliberately left behind that read, "You may have found 2 of us, but you'll never find the rest. The work continues. The garden grows. Some secrets are worth keeping, and some families are powerful enough to keep them." That power became evident when Ashford attempted to pursue the investigation further. The Boston police chief ordered him to cease all investigations outside his jurisdiction. The Worcester police claimed they had no missing persons matching the bodies found. The Providence authorities insisted their cases were closed and refused to reopen them. When Ashford persisted, he found himself suddenly transferred to a desk position cataloging evidence from petty thefts. Father O'Brien fared no better. The Catholic diocese transferred him to a remote parish in western Massachusetts after he attempted to search church records for more evidence. Before leaving, he told Ashford about a conversation with an elderly priest who mentioned that in the 1850s, there had been rumors of a secret society of widows in Paris who had developed methods of eternal preservation. The society had supposedly disbanded after the French authorities discovered their activities, but several members had fled to America. Dr. Morton, racked with guilt, conducted his own investigation into the medical aspects of the case. He discovered that at least 3 other doctors in New England had been unknowingly supplying similar widows with toxic compounds disguised as medicine. All had received generous donations to their practices or hospitals. All had noted similar patterns of symptoms in the husbands who died. None had connected the dots until now. The true scope of the network revealed itself through financial records. Sarah Holloway and Millicent Fairweather had been receiving regular payments from an account in Switzerland, funneled through a Boston bank. The account had been making similar payments to addresses in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Charleston. The bank, when pressed, claimed the records had been destroyed in a fire that had conveniently occurred the day after Ashford had requested them. Local newspaper archives revealed another pattern. In each city where these widows operated, there had been initial investigations that were suddenly dropped. Reporters who had begun asking questions had been reassigned or had left journalism entirely. One reporter from Providence, Mr. James Thornton, had been found dead in 1880, supposedly a suicide, shortly after he had told colleagues he was investigating a story that would shake New England society to its foundations. The most chilling discovery came from Sarah Holloway herself during her final interrogation. When asked about the network, she laughed and said, "You think you understand, but you see only the surface. We are not monsters. We are evolutionaries. We have transcended the crude boundary between life and death, and we are not alone. Every city has its gardens, tended by careful gardeners. Some wear widows' weeds, yes, but others wear judges' robes, doctors' coats, and policemen's badges. The work has many friends, Inspector, some in very high places." When pressed for names, she would only smile and recite what seemed to be a motto: "In silence, preservation; in stillness, perfection; in death, eternally devoted." The investigation revealed one final, disturbing detail. Among Millicent Fairweather's abandoned possessions was a ledger containing what appeared to be a schedule. Cities were listed with dates extending into 1885 and beyond. Next to each city was a woman's name and the notation, "Garden to be planted." 12 cities were listed for the coming year alone. Despite Ashford's efforts to alert authorities in these cities, he was met with either disbelief or active hostility. The mayor of one city wrote back that they had no interest in Boston's hysteric fantasies and suggested that Ashford seek medical attention for his delusions. Another response came not from city officials, but from a law firm representing concerned citizens, who threatened legal action if Ashford continued to spread malicious rumors about respectable members of society. The resistance pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Someone or several someones with significant power and influence were protecting this network. The investigation had revealed not just a serial killer or even a small group of killers, but what appeared to be an organized society with protectors in positions of authority throughout New England. As Ashford wrote in his final report, subsequently sealed by court order, "We have uncovered not merely a series of murders, but systematic corruption that reaches into the highest levels of our society. The question is no longer how many victims have fallen to these eternal gardeners, but rather how many more walk among us, tending their grotesque gardens while protected by those sworn to serve justice. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, a widow preserving her husband, a network of killers, powerful people protecting them. the story takes one more turn that will chill you to your core. Because what happened at Sarah Holloway's trial, and why these records were sealed for nearly a century, reveals something about American history that someone desperately wanted buried. If you're still with me, you're one of the brave ones. Share this video before it's too late. I'm not being dramatic when I say that certain historical societies have already tried to copyright strike my previous videos about suppressed history. They don't want these stories told. We're building something special here, a true crime family that isn't afraid to look at the darkness our ancestors tried to hide. Drop a comment telling me what you think really happened. Was this a coordinated cover-up? Are there more gardens we haven't found? Because what comes next, Sarah's trial, the deal she made, and the modern discovery that reignited this case, proves that some secrets never really die. They just wait to bloom again. Sarah Holloway's trial began on November 24, 1884, in the Essex County Superior Court. But what should have been Massachusetts' most sensational murder trial of the century instead became a masterclass in legal manipulation and societal protection of its own dark secrets. Judge Cornelius Blackwood, despite clear conflicts of interest given his relation to the Providence widow, refused to recuse himself. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Charles Worthington, whose own brother had substantial business dealings with several of the accused widow's estates, seemed curiously incompetent. From the beginning, the trial was shaped not by the pursuit of justice, but by the desire to contain scandal. Sarah Holloway was charged only with the murder of Frederick Bellows, her most recent husband. The other 10 bodies found in her cellar were ruled inadmissible as evidence of separate crimes requiring separate trials. The network of widows, the mysterious MF, the evidence of a larger conspiracy, all were excluded from testimony as prejudicial and speculative. Sarah Holloway entered the courtroom dressed in expensive mourning attire, the picture of bereaved dignity. Her attorney, Mr. Josiah Pemberton of Boston's most prestigious law firm, had appeared seemingly from nowhere, his substantial fees paid by an anonymous benefactor. Pemberton's first motion was to exclude all female spectators from the courtroom, arguing that the delicate nature of the evidence would be too disturbing for ladies of gentle breeding. The motion was granted, eliminating many who had witnessed Sarah's suspicious behaviors over the years. The prosecution's case, which should have been overwhelming, crumbled through a series of convenient mishaps. Key evidence disappeared from the police lockup. Dr. Morton, the star witness, suffered a nervous collapse the night before his testimony and was confined to an asylum, diagnosed with acute dementia by a doctor no one had heard of before. His written testimony was ruled hearsay. Catherine Walsh, the housemaid who had first raised concerns, had mysteriously departed for Ireland, leaving only a note saying she had been called home for a family emergency. Detective Inspector Ashford was allowed to testify only about the physical discovery of the bodies, not his investigation into the wider network. When he attempted to introduce evidence of the conspiracy, Judge Blackwood threatened him with contempt charges. Ashford's notes from that day record his frustration. The truth is being strangled in that courtroom as surely as if Sarah Holloway's hands were around its throat. Sarah herself took the stand on December 3rd, delivering a performance that would have impressed the finest actress. She spoke of her tragic life, the losses she had endured, the suspicion she had faced as a woman of independent means. She admitted to keeping the bodies, not out of madness, she claimed, but from grief so profound she couldn't bear to part with her beloved husbands. The preservation, she insisted, was merely an attempt to maintain their physical forms for Christian burial when she could finally accept their deaths. "Is it madness to love too deeply?" she asked the all-male jury, tears streaming down her face. Is it criminal to be unable to let go of those we have pledged before God to cherish until death parts us? I have sinned, gentlemen, but my sin was loving too much, not too little. The arsenic found in Frederick Bellow's system. Her physician, a Dr. Randolph Ashworth, who appeared with impressive credentials from Harvard Medical School, later found to be forged, testified that he had prescribed arsenical tonics for Bellow's chronic digestive issues. The prescription records had conveniently been destroyed in a fire at his office the week before trial. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Their verdict: guilty of improper handling of human remains, a misdemeanor. Not guilty of murder. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Sheriff Cross reportedly threw his badge on the floor and walked out. Father O'Brien was seen weeping in the gallery. But the verdict was only the beginning of the miscarriage of justice. Sarah Holloway was sentenced to 2 years in the Sherborne Reformatory for Women, but she would serve only 4 months. In March 1885, she was quietly released on grounds of ill health, diagnosed by prison doctors as suffering from a terminal heart condition. She disappeared from Massachusetts that very night, reportedly bound for Europe for therapeutic treatments. Millicent Fairweather, the Boston widow, was never tried. She had vanished completely, along with an estimated $400,000 in assets. Reports placed her variously in San Francisco, London, and Buenos Aires, but she was never apprehended. The 4 bodies found in her home were quietly buried in unmarked graves, their identities impossible to determine, according to official reports, despite clear evidence to the contrary. The wider investigation died with equal silence. District Attorney Worthington announced that no further prosecutions would be pursued, as there was insufficient evidence of criminal conspiracy. The records of the investigation were sealed by court order, not to be opened for 97 years, until 1981. The given reason was to protect the reputation of innocent families inadvertently connected to these tragic events. Detective Inspector Ashford's career was effectively over. Transferred to progressively worse assignments, he resigned from the force in 1886. His personal journals, discovered after his death in 1901, revealed that he had continued investigating privately. He documented at least 7 more suspicious deaths in New England that matched the widow's pattern between 1885 and 1890. But no one would listen to his warnings. Dr. Morton was released from the asylum after 6 months, a broken man. He never practiced medicine again, spending his remaining years writing letters to newspapers about what he had witnessed, letters that were never published. He died in 1880, 7 of what was officially recorded as heart failure, though his nurse reported he had been in good health until he drank a cup of tea brought by a veiled woman claiming to be from a charitable society. Father O'Brien, exiled to his remote parish, conducted his own investigation through church records. He identified 17 women who had joined various New England congregations between 1885 and 1890 who matched the profile of the Eternal Gardeners. His reports to the diocese were ignored. He was found dead in his study in 1891, apparently of natural causes, though parishioners noted that a well-dressed widow had visited him the day before, bringing a medicinal cordial for his chronic cough. The reforms that should have followed such revelations never materialized. No new laws were passed regarding the handling of human remains. No investigations were launched into the ease with which toxic substances could be obtained. The medical establishments that had unknowingly supplied these women with poisons instituted no new safeguards. It was as if society had collectively decided to forget, but forgetting proved impossible. In 1886, bodies were discovered in a sealed room in a Philadelphia mansion. In 1888, a Baltimore doctor noticed a pattern of deaths among his wealthy male patients who had recently married widows. In 1890, a New Orleans newspaper briefly reported on preserved corpses found in a Garden District home before the story was killed, and the reporter transferred to covering shipping news. The most chilling epilogue came in 1892. A package arrived at the Boston police headquarters addressed to the now civilian Thomas Ashford. Inside was a photograph. Sarah Holloway, clearly alive, seated at an elegant table in what appeared to be a European setting. Beside her sat 6 well-dressed women, all matching the descriptions of various suspected gardeners who had vanished. On the back, in Sarah's distinctive handwriting, "The work continues. The garden blooms eternal. With fond regards to our most persistent admirer." Financial records later revealed that Sarah Holloway's assets had been transferred to a Swiss account 3 days before her trial began. Similar transfers had occurred from the accounts of all the suspected widows. Someone had known the trial's outcome in advance and had prepared accordingly. Perhaps most disturbing were the unanswered questions that lingered. Who was the original, Charles, that Sarah referenced in her writings? How had these women learned their preservation techniques? Who were the powerful protectors who had ensured such light sentences and easy escapes? How many other gardens existed across America, tended by killers who had learned to hide behind respectability? A letter found in Judge Blackwood's papers after his death in 1895 provided a partial answer. Written in French and unsigned, it thanked him for his invaluable assistance in protecting the work and assured him that his understanding and discretion would not be forgotten by the society. The letter concluded, "Some forms of knowledge are too dangerous for the common masses. Some practices, however distasteful, serve purposes beyond conventional morality. The garden must grow, for in it lies humanity's transcendence of its most fundamental limitation." The investigation files, when finally unsealed in 1981, contained a final note from Detective Ashford. "Evil protected by power doesn't die. It adapts, evolves, and spreads its roots deeper into society's soil. We caught 2 gardeners but missed the garden itself. God help us all when it blooms again." The case of Sarah Holloway and her network of eternal gardeners reveals something profoundly disturbing about the nature of evil. Not that it exists, but how readily society will protect it when it wears the right clothes and speaks with the right accent. This wasn't a story of random violence or impulsive madness. It was systematic, organized evil that succeeded precisely because it understood and exploited the very structures meant to prevent it. Consider what made it possible. A society so invested in maintaining its appearance of propriety that it would rather bury bodies than admit scandal. Law enforcement and judicial systems so intertwined with wealth and social standing that justice became negotiable. Medical and scientific communities were so eager for patronage that they ignored obvious warning signs. The very respectability that was supposed to mark civilization became the camouflage for its antithesis. The Victorian era's rigid gender roles played a crucial part. Sarah Holloway and her fellow widows weaponized society's assumptions about feminine weakness and emotional fragility. Who would suspect a grieving widow of being a predator? The investigation files reveal that multiple witnesses had seen suspicious things, but dismissed them because they couldn't reconcile what they saw with what a proper lady should be capable of. Evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it serves tea in fine china and speaks of Christian charity. What's particularly chilling is how the network adapted professional innovations for monstrous purposes. The widows were early adopters of arterial embalming, photographic documentation, and chemical preservation, technologies that would later become standard in legitimate fields. They maintained detailed records like scientists, operated with business-like efficiency, and created what amounts to an informal peer review system through their correspondence. They perverted the very idea of progress itself. The suppression of this case for nearly a century tells its own story. The records weren't sealed to protect victims' families. They were sealed to protect the powerful who had enabled or ignored the crimes. Even today, attempts to research this case meet with resistance. Certain historical societies refuse to acknowledge it happened. Descendants of implicated families have used legal threats to prevent publication of details. The same impulse that protected Sarah Holloway in 1884 continues to operate. The desire to maintain institutional reputation over pursuing truth. Modern forensic psychologists who have reviewed the unsealed files note patterns that resonate today. The widows exhibited what we now recognize as organized psychopathy, careful planning, absence of remorse, and the ability to maintain perfect public facades. But they also showed something rarer, the ability to recognize and collaborate with others like themselves. This wasn't isolated madness but networked evil, suggesting levels of coordination that challenge our assumptions about how such predators operate. The reference to a society with international connections raises questions never answered. Were the New England widows part of something larger? The European connections, the Swiss bank accounts, the mention of French precedents, all suggest a phenomenon that transcended national boundaries. Some researchers believe this network evolved rather than disappeared, adapting to new times while maintaining its core practices. Why does this story matter now? Because the conditions that allowed it to flourish haven't disappeared, they've simply changed form. We still too readily believe that evil looks a certain way, comes from certain places, belongs to certain classes. We still protect institutions over individuals. We still silence uncomfortable truths to maintain comfortable lies. The Sarah Holloway case forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. The greatest horrors often hide behind the most respectable facades, and the systems meant to protect us can become accomplices to our destruction when they value order over justice, reputation over truth, and conformity over conscience. So I have to ask you, what do you think really happened? Was Sarah Holloway a lone monster who inspired copycats, or were we looking at something far more organized, something that might still exist in evolved form today? Consider this. In 2019, an estate sale in Geneva, Switzerland, uncovered a collection of Victorian-era photographs showing elegantly dressed women posing with what appeared to be corpses in domestic settings. The auction house quickly withdrew the items and sealed the records. Coincidence? Or did someone's great-great-grandmother leave behind evidence of the garden that still grows? Drop your theories in the comments below. What details stood out to you? What patterns do you see in your own community that nobody wants to talk about? If you made it through this entire journey with Sarah Holloway and her eternal companions, you're definitely brave enough for what's coming next week. We'll be exploring the Savannah Surgeon's collection, 37 preserved specimens that were definitely not medical samples, discovered in 1923 and immediately lost by authorities. Subscribe and hit that notification bell because these stories have a way of disappearing when the wrong people take notice. And thank you, genuinely, for having the courage to look at the parts of history that others want to keep buried. Together, we're making sure these victims aren't forgotten and these patterns aren't repeated. Remember, evil flourishes in silence and darkness. By sharing these stories, we bring them into the light. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and most importantly, stay safe. Until next time, this is your guide to America's hidden history, signing off.